Midnight Baltimore. 3 corrupt cops drag her into the alley. They're planning to solve the problem permanently. And she's the troublemaker? The brick wall pressed cold against Faith Brown's back as Sergeant Wilson pulled on latex gloves. Detective Martinez checked both ends of the alley while Officer Johnson positioned himself as lookout. 3 weeks you've been running around my city making noise, Wilson said, producing a switchblade that gleamed under the streetlight. No one will miss another dead troublemaker. Faith looked at the 3 men surrounding her, their confidence absolute. They had no idea who they were threatening. But this story begins 3 weeks earlier, when Faith Brown first walked the streets of Baltimore as bait. The autumn wind carried the scent of harbor salt and urban decay through Baltimore's eastern district. Faith walked slowly down Monument Street, her federal badge locked away in a safety deposit box across town. Today, she was just another black woman in a city where that alone made her a target. The blue Crown Victoria pulled alongside the curb with a deliberate slowness that made her skin crawl. Officer Johnson stepped out first, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. Behind him, Sergeant Wilson emerged, scanning the street like a predator marking territory. "Ma'am, can you step over here, please?" Johnson's voice carried that particular tone of false politeness that preceded most constitutional violations. Faith complied, moving toward the patrol car with measured steps. Her training screamed at her to identify herself, to flash her federal credentials and end this charade. But the wire taped against her ribs reminded her why she was here. "Where you headed in such a hurry?" Wilson asked, though Faith had been walking at a normal pace. "Just going to the store, officer." "Just going to the store, officer," Wilson mocked, his voice dripping with disdain. "You got some attitude on you, don't you?" Faith kept her voice steady, professional. "I'm just answering your question, sir." The first slap came without warning. Wilson's palm connected with her cheek, the sound echoing off the brick row houses like a gunshot. "Ma'am, you need to learn your place," Wilson said, adjusting his badge with casual arrogance. Faith touched her burning cheek, tasting blood where her teeth had cut her inner lip. She didn't fight back. She couldn't fight back. Not yet. Over the next week, Faith walked the streets of Baltimore like a ghost gathering evidence. Each encounter with the Baltimore PD painted the same ugly picture. The harassment wasn't random. It was policy. On Fayette Street, she watched Officer Martinez stop 3 black women in 10 minutes, each interaction escalating to verbal abuse. On Pennsylvania Avenue, Detective Cooper forced an elderly black man to empty his pockets because he looked suspicious while waiting for a bus. But it was the traffic stop on North Broadway that confirmed her worst fears. Wilson again. Different victim this time, a young mother with her toddler in the back seat. "License and registration," Wilson demanded, though Faith had witnessed no traffic violation. The woman's hands shook as she reached for her purse. "Officer, I was just—" "Did I ask you to speak?" Wilson's voice cut through the afternoon air like a blade. Faith positioned herself behind a parked car, her federal-issued recording device capturing every word. The woman handed over her documents with trembling fingers. "This registration is expired," Wilson lied. Faith could see the valid sticker from 30 feet away. "No, sir, it's current until—" The slap silenced her mid-sentence. The toddler began crying. "When I tell you something, you don't argue back," Wilson said, his voice rising above the child's wails. "You people need to learn respect." Faith's jaw clenched as she adjusted the recording device. The pattern was undeniable now. Multiple officers, multiple victims, same systematic abuse. "This isn't random," she whispered into her wire. "This is policy." Back at her hotel room, Faith stared at the growing evidence file. Phone recordings, witness statements, photographic documentation, a federal prosecutor's dream case. But the nightmare was just beginning. The setup required careful orchestration. Faith positioned herself at the corner of East Baltimore and Central Avenue at exactly 3:47 p.m., knowing Wilson's patrol route like a federal surveillance manual. When the Crown Victoria rounded the corner, she was ready. "You again," Wilson said, stepping out of his cruiser with the swagger of a man drunk on authority. "Didn't I tell you to stay off my streets?" Faith kept her voice level, professional. "Officer, I have the right to walk on public sidewalks." "Rights?" Wilson laughed. the sound harsh and metallic in the afternoon air. "Let me tell you about rights, sweetheart." The arrest was a foregone conclusion. Wilson cuffed her for obstruction of justice, a charge that would never hold up in court, and they both knew it. But court wasn't the destination. The Baltimore Police Department booking area was. Inside the station, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects. The smell of disinfectant mixed with fierce sweat created an atmosphere thick with institutional oppression. Faith cataloged every detail. The broken security camera in the corner, the Blue Lives Matter sticker on the booking sergeant's desk, the way officers clustered together like wolves sensing prey. Booking Sergeant Davis looked up from his paperwork with the weary expression of a man who'd processed thousands of made-up charges. "What we got, Wilson?" "Obstruction, failure to comply, attitude problem." Wilson's smile was predatory. "This one thinks she knows her rights." Faith remained silent as Davis processed her fabricated charges. But when he demanded she remove her jewelry, including her grandmother's wedding ring, something inside her snapped. "That ring has sentimental value," she said quietly. "I'd prefer to keep it on." Davis looked up sharply. "You'd prefer?" "Yes, sir. It's not a safety hazard and nothing," Davis interrupted. "You don't get preferences in my booking area." Faith's federal training kicked in. "Actually, according to Maryland state law." "According to what?" Wilson stepped closer, his breath hot against her face. "You some kind of lawyer now?" "I'm just stating." The slap echoed through the booking area like a thunderclap. Wilson's palm connected with Faith's cheek with enough force to snap her head sideways. The sound reverberated off the concrete walls, bouncing back from every corner of the room. Conversation stopped. Paperwork paused. Every officer in the booking area turned to watch. "Talking back to a police officer," Wilson announced to his audience. "Some people never learn." Faith tasted blood again, her cheek burning with the sting of public humiliation. But more importantly, she felt the tiny vibration against her ribs. The federal recording device, activated by voice command, was now capturing everything. "Ma'am," Davis said with mock sympathy, "you need to understand something. When you're in my house, you follow my rules. And rule number 1 is you don't talk back to my officers." Other officers gathered around, drawn by the spectacle like sharks sensing blood in the water. Detective Martinez smirked from behind the evidence counter. Officer Johnson leaned against the wall, arms crossed, enjoying the show. "She got something to say now?" Johnson called out. Faith remained silent, her cheek throbbing, her recording device working. Every word, every laugh, every casual cruelty was being preserved for federal prosecution. "That's what I thought," Wilson said, adjusting his badge with practiced arrogance. "Some people need to learn their place the hard way." As they led her to the holding cell, Faith caught sight of a motivational poster on the wall, "Serve and Protect." The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so tragic. But what these officers didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that every slap, every insult, every violation was being recorded on federal equipment with federal authorization for federal prosecution. The booking area returned to its normal rhythm. Officers resumed their paperwork. Conversations picked up where they left off. Just another day in Baltimore PD. Just another black woman who'd learned her place. Or so they thought. The law office of Phillips and Associates occupied the 3rd floor of a converted brownstone on Charles Street. Faith sat across from attorney Robert Phillips, her documentation spread across his mahogany desk like evidence in a federal courtroom. "This is substantial," Phillips admitted, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he reviewed Faith's complaint. "Multiple instances of excessive force, civil rights violations, unlawful arrest." Faith leaned forward, playing her role perfectly. "So you can help me file a formal complaint?" Phillips set down the papers and steepled his fingers. The gesture reminded Faith of dozens of federal prosecutors she'd worked with over the years, but something in his eyes made her skin crawl. "Miss Brown, let me be frank with you," Phillips said, his voice taking on a tone of practiced sympathy. "These are serious allegations against respected members of the Baltimore Police Department." "Respected?" Faith's voice carried genuine incredulity. "Sergeant Wilson has been with the department for 15 years, exemplary service record. Detective Martinez has received multiple commendations. Phillips shuffled through his desk drawer, producing a business card with the Baltimore Police Union logo. I've worked with these officers many times. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker. Faith realized she was looking at the other half of the corruption equation, the legal protection racket that kept bad cops on the street. Are you saying you won't take my case? Phillips spread his hands in a gesture of false regret. I'm saying you're fighting a losing battle, Miss Brown. Baltimore PD has procedures. Internal Affairs will investigate. Justice will be served through proper channels. Faith gathered her papers with steady hands, though her heart was racing. And if Internal Affairs finds no wrongdoing? Then perhaps, Phillips said with a patronizing smile, you might consider that these officers were just doing their job. Walking out of Phillips's office, Faith felt the familiar weight of systemic corruption pressing down like a heavy blanket. The local legal system wasn't just failing victims, it was actively protecting their abusers. Time for federal intervention. Baltimore City Hall rose from downtown like a monument to municipal dysfunction. Faith's footsteps echoed in the marble corridors as she made her way to the mayor's office, carrying her last hope for local justice in a manila folder. Mayor Patricia Anderson's office overlooked the inner harbor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city she claimed to serve. Anderson herself sat behind a desk the size of a small conference table, her political smile as polished as her mahogany furniture. Miss Brown, thank you for coming, Anderson said, gesturing toward a chair positioned deliberately lower than her own. I understand you have some concerns about our police department. Faith placed her documentation on the mayor's desk. Mayor Anderson, I have evidence of systematic police misconduct, multiple civil rights violations by the same officers. Anderson glanced at the papers without picking them up. These are very serious allegations. Yes, ma'am. I'm hoping you can ensure a proper investigation. Investigation? Anderson's smile never wavered, but her eyes grew cold. Miss Brown, let me explain something about how this city works. Our police officers put their lives on the line every day to keep our communities safe. Sometimes that requires firm enforcement. Faith felt the familiar chill of institutional indifference. Firm enforcement doesn't include slapping citizens for asking questions, doesn't it? Anderson leaned back in her chair, her political mask slipping slightly. Miss Brown, some people in this city need to accept their station in life. Some people need to understand that when they make trouble, there are consequences. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Are you threatening me, Mayor Anderson? I'm educating you, Anderson replied smoothly. Baltimore is a complex city with complex problems. Sometimes outsiders don't understand our unique solutions. Faith gathered her papers with deliberate calm. So you won't be ordering an investigation? Mayor Anderson's smile returned, bright and empty as a campaign poster. I have complete confidence in our police leadership and their internal review processes. Walking out of City Hall, Faith felt the full weight of local corruption pressing down like a storm front. The police were corrupt. The lawyers were complicit. The mayor was actively protecting the system. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They assumed she was just another victim with nowhere to turn. They had no idea they were threatening a federal officer. The Eastside Community Center occupied a converted church on North Avenue, its stained glass windows casting colorful shadows across folding chairs arranged in a circle. Faith had advertised the meeting as a community safety discussion, hoping to find other victims willing to speak. Only 7 people showed up. They sat in the circle like survivors of a disaster, each carrying their own invisible wounds. Mrs. Rosa Washington, 73, kept her hands folded in her lap. Marcus Thompson, 25, still wore sunglasses indoors to hide a black eye. Sarah Martinez held her infant daughter close, protective and wary. Thank you all for coming, Faith began, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. I know this isn't easy to talk about. Silence stretched between them like a held breath. I was stopped last week, Faith continued. Officer Wilson, he became physical when I asked why I was being detained. Mrs. Washington looked up sharply. Wilson? Yes, ma'am. Sergeant Wilson. Baltimore PD. Child. Mrs. Washington's voice was barely a whisper. You don't want to cross Wilson. He got connections all the way up to City Hall. Marcus shifted in his seat. She's right. I filed a complaint against Wilson 2 years ago. Next thing I know, my parole officer is asking why I'm making trouble for good police officers. Sarah bounced her baby gently, her voice trembling. They pulled me over 3 times last month. Same officers every time. Sergeant Wilson, Detective Martinez. They said if I kept causing problems, they'd call Child Protective Services. Faith felt her federal prosecutor instincts sharpening. How many of you have been targeted by the same officers? Every hand in the circle went up. This is bigger than random harassment, Faith said carefully. This is systematic intimidation. Mrs. Washington stood slowly, her arthritis making every movement deliberate. She walked to Faith with the careful steps of someone who'd survived too many battles. "Child," she whispered, leaning close enough that only Faith could hear. "You're not the first federal person to ask these questions." Faith's blood went cold. "What do you mean?" 3 years ago, another woman came around, young, professional, asked the same questions, took the same notes. Mrs. Washington's eyes were dark with memory. She disappeared after 2 weeks. Word was she went back to Washington, but I saw her car in the harbor 3 months later. The community center suddenly felt smaller, the shadows deeper. Faith realized she wasn't just investigating corruption. She was walking into a graveyard. The abandoned warehouse on Eastern Avenue provided perfect sight lines to the Baltimore PD substation. Faith had transformed the third-floor corner office into a federal surveillance post, complete with high-definition cameras, directional microphones, and encrypted communication equipment that would make the NSA jealous. Her laptop screen glowed with federal surveillance software, tracking patrol car movements in real time through GPS data she'd accessed with her Justice Department credentials. Wilson's car was currently stopped outside Tony's liquor store, his third protection visit this week. Faith adjusted the telephoto lens, focusing on Wilson through the store's front window. The shop owner, an elderly Korean man, handed over an envelope thick with cash. No receipt, no record. Just another transaction in Baltimore's protection racket. "Federal surveillance log, day 12, Faith spoke into her encrypted recorder. "Sergeant Wilson continuing systematic extortion of local businesses. This marks the 43rd documented payment from 7 different establishments." Her phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Justice Department headquarters. "Wire authorization approved, full federal backing." Faith smiled grimly. Every conversation, every threat, every illegal transaction was now being recorded with federal court authorization. When this case went to trial, the evidence would be bulletproof. Movement in her peripheral vision made her freeze. A Baltimore PD patrol car was slowly cruising the warehouse district, searchlights sweeping across abandoned buildings. Faith killed her laptop screen and pressed herself against the wall. The searchlight passed across her window twice, lingering each time. Through her scope, she could see Officer Johnson behind the wheel, his eyes scanning the building methodically. Had they spotted her equipment? Had someone tipped them off? Faith held her breath as the patrol car completed another pass. Johnson's radio crackled and she caught fragments through her directional microphone. "All clear. Nobody in Sector 7. The car moved on, disappearing around the corner toward Patterson Park. Faith's heart pounded as she powered up her equipment again. Wilson was still inside the liquor store, still collecting his illegal tribute, still creating federal evidence with every word he spoke. Her phone displayed another encrypted message. "Backup team positioned. Federal response ready." Faith smiled in the darkness. Let them search. Let them patrol. They were hunting for a civilian victim who didn't exist. What they'd found was a federal trap 20 years in the making. The police station's break room smelled like stale coffee and institutional arrogance. Faith crouched in the maintenance corridor above, her federal recording equipment capturing every word through the ventilation system. Getting here had required lock-picking skills from her FBI training and patience learned through 2 decades of federal investigations. Below, Sergeant Wilson held court like a king among his subjects. $4,700 this week, Wilson announced, counting bills with the casual efficiency of a bank teller. Tony's Liquor kicked in an extra $500 after I explained the new security rates. Detective Martinez laughed from his position by the coffee maker. "Man's learning quick. Remember when he tried to tell us he couldn't afford protection?" "That was before his windows got broken," Officer Johnson added, unwrapping a sandwich. Funny how vandalism drops off once business owners invest in proper police relations. Faith adjusted her recording device, ensuring every word was captured in federal quality audio. These weren't just confessions, they were detailed admissions of racketeering, extortion, and civil rights violations. "What about that brown woman?" Martinez asked. "She's still nosing around the neighborhood?" Wilson's laugh was harsh and confident. "That troublemaker, I put her in her place. Some people need to learn respect the hard way." "You think she'll file another complaint?" Johnson wondered. "Let her try," Wilson said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Phillips keeps those complaints buried, and Mayor Anderson won't touch anything that makes us look bad. We got this city locked down tight." Martinez nodded approvingly. "Speaking of lockdown, you hear about that federal investigation rumor?" Wilson's expression darkened. "What federal investigation?" "Word from City Hall is some federal bitch was asking questions about our procedures. Anderson told her to mind her own business." "Federal, huh?" Wilson's smile was predatory. "Well, that federal bitch will never touch us. We own this city. Police, lawyers, politicians. They can investigate all they want. We're untouchable." Above them, Faith smiled in the darkness as her federal recording equipment captured every incriminating word. Untouchable. They had no idea how wrong they were. Faith's encrypted phone buzzed at exactly 11:47 p.m. The caller ID showed only Secure Line DOJ. She answered on the second ring, expecting her regular check-in with Assistant Attorney General Richards. Instead, a voice she didn't recognize filled her earpiece. "Agent Brown, this is Deputy Assistant Director Morrison, Internal Affairs Division." Faith's blood chilled. Internal Affairs only got involved when federal agents were suspected of misconduct. "Sir, I wasn't expecting—" "Your Baltimore operation has come to our attention," Morrison interrupted, his voice carrying the cold authority of someone accustomed to ending careers. "We have concerns." Faith moved to her hotel window, scanning the street below for surveillance. "What kind of concerns, sir?" "The kind that end federal investigations," Morrison said bluntly. "Miss Brown, you're operating in a sensitive political environment. Baltimore PD has strong relationships with federal oversight agencies. Your methods are creating diplomatic complications." "Diplomatic complications?" Faith's voice sharpened with federal prosecutor instincts. "Sir, I have documented evidence of systematic civil rights violations, racketeering, extortion." "Evidence obtained through questionable means," Morrison replied. "Undercover operations require specific authorization protocols. Did you follow those protocols, Agent Brown?" The question hung in the air like a trap waiting to spring. Faith realized she was being tested, possibly recorded. "All operations are within federal guidelines, sir." "Are they?" Morrison's laugh was humorless. "Agent Brown, let me be clear. Some investigations are too sensitive for field-level decision-making. Some relationships are too important to jeopardize over local police procedures." Faith felt the walls closing in. "Are you ordering me to terminate this investigation?" "I'm ordering you to reassess your priorities," Morrison said. "Baltimore is a complex jurisdiction with complex political considerations. Sometimes federal agents need to accept that local solutions work better than federal interference." The line went dead. Faith stared at her phone, her mind racing through the implications. Someone in Washington was protecting Baltimore PD, someone with enough authority to deploy internal affairs as a threat. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They assumed she was just another federal agent who could be intimidated by bureaucratic pressure. They had no idea she was operating under direct authorization from the Attorney General himself. The real question was, how deep did this corruption go? The parking garage beneath the Baltimore Federal Courthouse was empty at 2 a.m., except for two figures meeting in the shadows between concrete pillars. Faith had called the meeting using her emergency federal protocols, requesting immediate assistance from someone she could trust. Federal Prosecutor Jennifer Davis emerged from behind a support column, her briefcase clutched tightly against her chest. 20 years of prosecuting federal cases had taught her to be paranoid, but this meeting felt different, dangerous. "This better be good, Faith," Davis whispered, her breath visible in the October cold. "If someone sees us meeting like this—" Faith handed over a thumb drive containing copies of her surveillance evidence. "Jennifer, what I'm about to show you will end careers, possibly including ours." Davis plugged the drive into her encrypted laptop, the screen illuminating their faces with blue light. As she reviewed the files, recordings, photographs, financial documentation, her expression shifted from skepticism to shock to professional fury. Jesus Christ, Faith, this is... Davis paused, scrolling through Wilson's confession recording. This is a RICO case. Federal racketeering charges. It gets worse, Faith said, producing her second phone. Someone from DOJ Internal Affairs tried to shut down my investigation last night. Deputy Assistant Director Morrison. Davis looked up sharply. Morrison? Faith, Morrison died in a car accident 6 months ago. The garage felt suddenly colder, the shadows deeper. Faith realized she'd been talking to someone using a dead man's credentials, someone with access to federal personnel files and classified phone numbers. How deep does this go? Faith whispered. Deep enough to fake federal authority, Davis replied, closing her laptop with shaking hands. Faith, if they're willing to impersonate dead federal officials, they'll kill to protect this secret. Then we need to move fast, Faith said. How quickly can you get this to the Attorney General? Davis's smile was grim but determined. We don't go to the Attorney General, Faith. This goes all the way to Washington. We need someone who can't be bought, threatened, or compromised. Who? The one person in federal law enforcement who answers only to the Constitution, Davis said, pulling out her own encrypted phone. We're calling the Inspector General. Faith felt a surge of hope for the first time in days. The Inspector General's office was independent, answerable only to Congress and the American people. If anyone could break this corruption network, it was them. But as Davis dialed the number, Faith couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The Federal Evidence Facility in Greenbelt, Maryland resembled a cross between a bank vault and a digital fortress. Faith followed Inspector General Agent Patricia Williams through biometric scanners and reinforced steel doors, carrying the culmination of her Baltimore investigation in secured briefcases. This is unprecedented, Williams said, her voice echoing in the sterile corridors. In 30 years of federal oversight, I've never seen corruption this systematic. They entered Evidence Room 7, where Faith's investigation had been transformed into a prosecutor's dream. Wall-mounted monitors displayed financial flowcharts showing money moving from Baltimore businesses through police accounts to offshore holdings. Audio equipment played crystal-clear recordings of federal crimes being committed in real time. Talk me through the scope, Williams said, settling behind a conference table laden with federal documentation. Faith activated the main display. We have 47 documented instances of civil rights violations by 9 Baltimore PD officers. Systematic extortion of 32 local businesses generating approximately $200,000 monthly in illegal revenue. The screen shifted to surveillance photographs. Pattern evidence showing coordination between police, local attorneys, and municipal officials to suppress federal oversight. And this. Faith pulled up the audio file from the station break room. Direct confession to federal crimes recorded on federal authority. Williams listened to Wilson's voice bragging about being untouchable, her expression growing darker with each word. This is federal racketeering, civil rights conspiracy. We could prosecute under RICO statutes and get life sentences. There's more, Faith said, producing her final piece of evidence. Financial analysis shows this corruption network has been operating for over 15 years. Conservative estimate? They've stolen over $36 million from the Baltimore community while systematically violating civil rights. Williams stood, pacing to the evidence wall. Photographs of victims covered one entire section, men, women, children, elderly residents, all targeted by the same corrupt officers, all failed by the same broken system. The question isn't whether we have enough evidence to prosecute, Williams said finally. The question is whether we can move fast enough to prevent them from destroying what we've built. As if summoned by her words, Williams's secure phone buzzed with an urgent message. Her face went pale as she read. Faith, we have a problem. Baltimore PD just issued an APB for your arrest. They're claiming you're a federal fugitive wanted for terrorism. Faith felt the corruption network closing in like a noose. They discovered her true identity. Now it was a race against time. The Baltimore City Council meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m., but Faith arrived at 6:30, knowing Wilson and his crew would be watching. She walked up the marble steps of City Hall like a woman with nothing left to lose, which is exactly what she wanted them to think. Inside, the council chambers buzzed with the usual municipal drama, budget disputes, zoning arguments, the mundane machinery of local government. Faith took a seat in the public gallery, knowing her presence would be reported within minutes. She didn't have to wait long. Wilson entered through the back entrance at 6:45, flanked by Detective Martinez and Officer Johnson. They moved through the chamber like predators who'd cornered their prey, their confidence absolute. Mayor Anderson called the meeting to order at exactly 7 p.m. Before we begin tonight's agenda, I understand we have a security concern. Faith stood slowly, her voice carrying across the chamber. Mayor Anderson, I'm here to address the systematic violation of civil rights by the Baltimore Police Department. The room fell silent. City council members exchanged glances. Citizens in the gallery turned to stare at the woman who dared to challenge the system publicly. Wilson stepped forward, his hand resting on his service weapon. Ma'am, you need to leave immediately. You're wanted for questioning in a federal terrorism investigation. Faith smiled, the expression cold and controlled. Is that what you're calling civil rights documentation now? Terrorism? I'm calling it what it is, Wilson said, moving closer. Interference with police operations, conspiracy against public safety. Mayor Anderson, this woman has been harassing police officers and intimidating witnesses. Mayor Anderson nodded gravely. Sergeant Wilson, please remove this disruptive individual. This was the moment. Faith felt the federal recording equipment against her ribs, capturing every word for federal prosecution. Around the chamber, she spotted the nearly invisible earpieces of federal agents positioned as civilians, ready to spring their trap. Remove me? Faith asked, her voice carrying just a hint of amusement. Sergeant Wilson, are you sure you want to assault someone in front of all these witnesses? Wilson's smile was predatory. Ma'am, resisting arrest is a serious offense. Arrest? Faith looked around the chamber theatrically. On what charges? Disturbing the peace will do, Wilson said, reaching for his handcuffs. You people need to learn when to shut up. The trap was set. The federal recording was running. 30 federal agents waited for her signal. Time to spring it. The city council chamber had transformed into an arena of institutional power. Wilson advanced on Faith with the calculated movements of a predator who'd never faced consequences, while Martinez and Johnson flanked her escape routes. The gallery of citizens watched in stunned silence as democracy revealed its ugliest face. Ma'am, you're coming with us, Wilson said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been challenged. Disturbing the peace, interfering with police operations. Faith remained seated, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Officers, I'm exercising my constitutional right to address my elected representatives. Constitution? Martinez laughed harshly. Lady, the only right you got is the right to remain silent, which you should have used about 2 weeks ago. Mayor Anderson watched from her elevated platform, her expression a mixture of political calculation and barely concealed satisfaction. Sergeant Wilson, please escort this individual out of chambers. Wilson grabbed Faith's arm, his grip designed to cause pain without leaving marks. Get up, now! Faith rose slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. Around the chamber, she could feel tension building like pressure in a steam pipe. The citizens in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, sensing they were witnessing something that would define their city's character. You know what your problem is? Wilson said, his face inches from Faith's. You don't know your place. Some people need to learn respect. Johnson stepped closer, his bulk blocking Faith's view of the exit. My grandmother used to say, empty barrels make the most noise. Looks like we got ourselves an empty barrel. Empty barrel? Faith's voice carried just a hint of amusement. That's interesting police philosophy. Wilson's grip tightened on her arm. What's interesting is how you keep running your mouth when you should be listening. The chamber had fallen completely silent now. Even the council members leaned forward, drawn by the spectacle of raw power asserting itself. Sergeant Wilson, Faith said quietly, are you planning to assault me in front of all these witnesses? Wilson's smile was cold and confident. Assault? Ma'am, I'm just helping a disruptive citizen find her way out. His free hand rose toward her face. The same motion Faith had witnessed dozens of times over the past 3 weeks. The same gesture that had silenced countless victims. The same abuse of power that had poisoned an entire community. But this time would be different. This time, the victim had federal authority to end his career. The alley behind Baltimore City Hall reeked of stale urine and institutional corruption. Faith found herself pressed against cold brick, surrounded by 3 men who'd decided she was too dangerous to live. "Should have minded your own business," Wilson said, his service weapon drawn but pointed at the ground. "Some people just don't know when to quit." Martinez checked both ends of the alley while Johnson positioned himself as lookout. They moved with the coordination of men who'd done this before, their actions suggesting Faith wasn't their first problem to solve permanently. 3 weeks, Wilson continued, his voice conversational despite the circumstances. 3 weeks you've been running around my city asking questions, filing complaints, making noise. You think this is some kind of game? Faith's back pressed against the brick wall, feeling every rough edge through her jacket. Her federal backup was positioned around City Hall, but they were expecting to move inside the building, not in this forgotten alley where screams wouldn't carry. Game? Faith's voice remained steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I think this is a federal investigation." "Federal investigation," Johnson laughed, the sound echoing off the brick walls. "Lady, you're about to become a missing person case. Another black woman who ran into the wrong kind of trouble." Wilson holstered his weapon and pulled on latex gloves with practiced efficiency. "You know what the beauty of Baltimore is? People disappear all the time. Drug deals gone wrong, gang violence, random street crime. No one will miss another dead troublemaker," Martinez added, producing a switchblade that gleamed under the alley's single streetlight. Faith realized with crystal clarity that she was moments away from becoming another casualty in Baltimore's war against justice. These men had killed before. They would kill again, unless she stopped playing victim. Time to reveal who she really was. Wilson's latex-gloved hand reached toward Faith's throat when she spoke 4 words that changed everything. "Faith Brown, federal agent." Wilson froze mid-motion, his hand suspended in the air like a statue interrupted. "What did you say?" Faith reached slowly into her jacket, her movements deliberate and controlled. From an inner pocket, she produced a leather credential case that gleamed with federal authority under the streetlight. "Faith Brown," she repeated, flipping open the case to reveal her badge and identification. "Chief Inspector, Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division." The alley fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic on Pratt Street. Martinez's switchblade wavered in his grip. Johnson's mouth hung open like a fish gasping for air. Wilson stared at the federal badge as if it were a hallucination. That's not possible." 23 years with the Justice Department, Faith said, her voice now carrying the cold authority of federal law enforcement. "Specializing in police corruption and civil rights violations, currently operating under direct authorization from the Attorney General's office." "You're lying," Wilson whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. Faith smiled, the expression predatory and satisfied. "Sergeant Wilson, for the past 3 weeks you've been committing federal crimes against a federal officer. Every slap, every threat, every violation has been recorded under federal wire authorization." She pulled out her encrypted recording device, pressing play. Wilson's own voice filled the alley. "That federal bitch will never touch us. We own this city." The color drained from Wilson's face like water from a broken dam. "Federal bitch," Faith repeated, savoring each word. "That was your first mistake, Sergeant. Your second mistake was assaulting a federal officer. Your third mistake was conspiracy to commit murder against a federal agent." Martinez dropped his switchblade, the metal clattering against the asphalt. "Jesus Christ, Wilson! You said she was just some troublemaker." "She was supposed to be," Wilson stammered, backing away from Faith like she was radioactive. "Intelligence said she was just a local activist." "Your intelligence was wrong," Faith said, pinning her federal badge to her jacket with ceremonial precision. The shield caught the streetlight, reflecting federal authority back at men who'd thought themselves untouchable. "This entire conversation is being recorded for federal prosecution," Faith continued, speaking into her wire. "Conspiracy to commit murder, attempted assault on a federal officer, civil rights violations under color of law." Wilson's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, then stopped as the reality of his situation sank in. Attacking a federal agent was a life sentence, maybe the death penalty. "Game over, Sergeant," Faith said quietly. "You just lost to the federal government." Faith walked through the front entrance of Baltimore Police Department like a conquering general entering occupied territory. Her federal badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and every officer in the building could feel the seismic shift in power that came with her presence. "Attention all personnel," Faith announced, her voice carrying the absolute authority of the federal government. "I am Chief Inspector Faith Brown, Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. This facility is now under federal jurisdiction pending completion of our investigation." The booking area fell silent. Officers stopped their paperwork. Conversations died mid-sentence. For 3 weeks, they'd known Faith as a victim to be abused. Now she stood before them as federal authority incarnate. Desk Sergeant Davis looked up from his computer terminal, his face pale with understanding. "Ma'am, you can't just—" "I can, and I am," Faith interrupted, producing her federal warrant. "This document grants me authority to assume operational control of this facility under Section 14141 of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act." Detective Martinez emerged from the evidence room, his swagger replaced by nervous uncertainty. "Look, if this is about Wilson, this is about systematic violation of federal civil rights laws," Faith said, her voice cutting through the air like a federal judge's gavel. "This is about racketeering, extortion, and conspiracy under color of law. This is about 3 weeks of documented federal crimes committed by multiple officers in this department." She walked to the center of the booking area, the same space where Wilson had slapped her for talking back. The irony was lost on no one. "Every officer involved in civil rights violations, financial crimes, or obstruction of federal investigations will be arrested and charged under federal statutes," Faith continued. "Federal prosecutors are currently reviewing evidence for RICO indictments. Federal sentencing guidelines for these crimes start at 15 years. Officer Johnson appeared at the top of the stairs, his face twisted with disbelief and rage. "You can't do this! We got rights!" Faith's smile was cold as winter in Washington. "You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to federal legal representation. You have the right to be prosecuted in federal court under federal sentencing guidelines." The station's communication system crackled to life with federal authority. "All Baltimore PD units, this is Federal Command. Report to headquarters immediately for debriefing. Any units attempting to destroy evidence will face additional federal charges." Faith turned to Sergeant Davis, whose hands shook as he reached for his radio. "Sergeant, place calls to every officer currently on duty. Tell them to return to base immediately. And if they refuse, then they'll be fugitives from federal justice," Faith said simply. "Federal marshals don't negotiate." The transformation was complete. Baltimore Police Department was no longer a local law enforcement agency. It was federal territory. The rumble of federal vehicles filled Eastern Avenue like thunder announcing a storm. Faith watched through the station windows as black SUVs positioned themselves around the building, each one carrying federal agents trained in corruption investigations. "Baltimore PD, this is FBI Special Agent Richardson," the loudspeaker announced. "The building is now under federal control. All personnel will exit with hands visible and report for debriefing." Inside the station, panic spread like wildfire. Officers scrambled to destroy evidence, delete files, and communicate with their criminal contacts. But Faith had anticipated their desperation. "Computer access is terminated," she announced to the booking area. "Federal cybercrime specialists have secured all digital systems. Any attempts to destroy evidence will result in additional charges for obstruction of justice." Detective Martinez made a desperate break for the evidence locker, clutching a manila envelope thick with protection money. He made it 3 steps before federal agents poured through the entrance. "Federal agents, nobody move!" The station erupted in controlled chaos as federal law enforcement took control. FBI agents secured computer terminals while Justice Department investigators began cataloging evidence. U.S. Marshals positioned themselves at every exit. Wilson appeared at the top of the stairs, his service weapon drawn in a final act of desperate defiance. "I ain't going down for this." "Sergeant Wilson," Faith called out, her voice calm and professional. "You're surrounded by 30 federal agents. Put down your weapon and surrender peacefully." "You destroyed my life!" Wilson screamed. "You destroyed your own life," Faith replied. "You destroyed it the moment you decided federal civil rights laws didn't apply to you." Federal sharpshooters positioned themselves behind bulletproof shields, their laser sights painting red dots across Wilson's chest. The man who'd slapped a federal officer for talking back now faced the full might of the United States government. Wilson's weapon clattered to the floor as he raised his hands in surrender. "Federal agents, you're all under arrest," Faith announced to the assembled officers. Justice had arrived in Baltimore. The federal operation unfolded across Baltimore like a carefully choreographed symphony of justice. At exactly 9:47 p.m., 37 federal agents moved simultaneously against the corruption network that had poisoned the city for over 15 years. At Baltimore Police Department, Wilson was cuffed with his own handcuffs while federal agents read him his Miranda rights. "Sergeant Daniel Wilson, you're under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights, racketeering, extortion, and attempted murder of a federal officer." Across town at Phillips and Associates Law Office, FBI agents served a federal warrant while attorney Robert Phillips desperately tried to flush documents down his private bathroom. "Federal agents, step away from that toilet!" The evidence survived. Phillips didn't escape. Mayor Patricia Anderson was arrested at her Guilford mansion while hosting a fundraising dinner for Baltimore's social elite. Federal agents walked past champagne-sipping donors to place handcuffs on the woman who'd threatened a federal officer in her own office. "Mayor Anderson, you're under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights and obstruction of a federal investigation." The dinner guests watched in stunned silence as their mayor was escorted past the hors d'oeuvres table in federal custody. Detective Martinez made a run for the Pennsylvania border, his car loaded with cash and falsified police reports. Pennsylvania State Police intercepted him at the Maryland line, where federal marshals were waiting with an arrest warrant. "Going somewhere, Detective?" At the Baltimore Harbor, federal agents raided a warehouse owned by the police union, discovering financial records that detailed 15 years of systematic extortion. Union President Michael O'Brien was arrested while trying to burn ledgers that documented protection payments from over 200 Baltimore businesses. "Federal agents, drop the lighter." The evidence went up in smoke, but digital copies were already secured in federal custody. Officer Johnson surrendered peacefully at his East Baltimore home, understanding that resistance was futile when facing federal authority. His arrest warrant listed 43 counts of civil rights violations. By midnight, 17 members of the Baltimore corruption network were in federal custody. Federal prosecutors had enough evidence to seek life sentences under RICO statutes. "The federal government doesn't negotiate with corrupt officials," Faith told reporters gathered outside the federal building. "Justice delayed is not justice denied when federal authority gets involved." Baltimore's reign of terror was over. The federal cleanup was just beginning. The Edward A. Garmatz Federal Building's press room hadn't seen this level of media attention since the last major terrorism case. Cameras from CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and every major network filled the room wall to wall, their lenses focused on the podium where federal justice would be served publicly. Faith stood at the microphone at exactly 10 a.m., flanked by FBI Director Morrison and Assistant Attorney General Richards. Behind them, a massive display showed photographs of every arrested officer alongside their federal charges. "Good morning," Faith began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd stared down corruption and won. "I am Chief Inspector Faith Brown, Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Last night, federal agents arrested 17 individuals in connection with the largest police corruption investigation in Baltimore's history." The press room erupted with questions, but Faith continued without pause. "For over 15 years, members of the Baltimore Police Department operated a criminal organization that systematically violated the civil rights of Baltimore residents while extorting money from local businesses. They collected over $36 million in illegal revenue while assaulting, intimidating, and terrorizing the community they swore to protect." She gestured to the evidence display. Federal investigators documented 237 separate civil rights violations, 47 instances of extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder against a federal officer. CNN's national correspondent raised her hand. "Inspector Brown, can you tell us about your undercover operation?" Faith's smile was professional, but cold. For 3 weeks, I operated undercover as a civilian to document systematic police abuse. During that time, I was physically assaulted multiple times by officers who had no idea they were committing federal crimes against a federal agent. She paused, letting the impact sink in. Yesterday evening, Sergeant Daniel Wilson and 2 other officers attempted to murder me in an alley behind City Hall. Their confession to attempted murder was recorded under federal wire authorization. Fox News shouted a question. What's the federal response? The federal response is comprehensive. Assistant Attorney General Richards stepped forward. We're seeking RICO indictments against all 17 defendants. Federal sentencing guidelines for these crimes range from 15 years to life imprisonment. The room exploded with follow-up questions, but Faith had saved the most important announcement for last. Additionally, the Department of Justice is placing Baltimore Police Department under federal consent decree. Federal oversight will continue until this department proves it can serve its community without violating constitutional rights. The story would lead every national newscast that night. Baltimore's corruption had become America's problem, and America was watching. The Federal Oversight Office occupied the entire 3rd floor of the Baltimore Federal Building, its windows offering a commanding view of the city that would now operate under federal supervision. Faith reviewed implementation protocols while federal administrators established new command structures designed to prevent future corruption. Inspector Brown, Federal Monitor Susan Richardson approached with a thick briefcase full of consent decree documentation. We're getting pushback from the remaining Baltimore officials. Faith looked up from her desk, which was covered with organizational charts showing the new federal oversight structure. What kind of pushback? City Council is threatening to sue, claiming federal overreach, Richardson replied. They're arguing that local governments have constitutional autonomy. Faith's laugh was humorless. Local autonomy ends where civil rights violations begin. What's their specific complaint? They object to federal monitors in police stations, federal approval for police policies, and federal control of police budgets, Richardson said, reading from her notes. Then they shouldn't have spent 15 years violating federal law, Faith replied sharply. Federal oversight isn't punishment, Monitor Richardson. It's protection for a community that local government failed to serve. Through her window, Faith could see the Baltimore Police Department building now flying both state and federal flags. Federal monitors were stationed in every division, ensuring that constitutional rights were respected and criminal behavior was reported immediately. Her secure phone buzzed with a message from the Attorney General's office. Baltimore consent decree approved by federal court. Duration minimum 5 years, maximum indefinite. Faith smiled as she typed her response. Federal standards now in effect. Baltimore PD will serve its community or answer to federal authority. The transformation was complete. Baltimore would rebuild under federal supervision with federal resources following federal standards that put civil rights ahead of police convenience. Local corruption had met federal justice. Federal justice had won. The Eastside Community Center had been transformed from a place of fear into a sanctuary of healing. Faith stood before the same circle of folding chairs where she'd first met the victims of Baltimore's corruption, but now the room was filled with hope instead of despair. Mrs. Rosa Washington sat in her familiar chair, but her hands no longer trembled. Marcus Thompson had removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes clear of fear for the first time in years. Sarah Martinez held her daughter proudly, no longer afraid of retaliation. 17 federal arrests, Faith announced to the assembled crowd of 60 residents. 47 federal indictments, complete federal oversight of Baltimore Police Department. The room erupted in applause, but Faith raised her hand for silence. More importantly, federal victim assistance programs are now available. Counseling services, legal aid, and financial compensation for anyone harmed by police corruption. Mrs. Washington stood slowly, her voice carrying across the room with new strength. Child, you kept your promise. You said federal protection would come, and it did. Faith felt tears she hadn't expected. Mrs. Washington, federal protection means you can finally speak up safely. All of you can. A teenager raised her hand from the back of the room. Inspector Brown, how do we know the federal government won't just leave when the cameras stop rolling? Faith's smile was warm but determined. Because federal consent decrees last until communities are truly safe. That's not months or years. That's however long it takes. The healing had begun. Faith stood on the steps of Baltimore City Hall, the same building where corrupt officials had threatened her 3 weeks ago. Now it flew federal flags alongside state colors, symbolizing the new reality of federal oversight. A crowd of several hundred Baltimore residents had gathered, representing communities that had suffered under police corruption for generations. News cameras captured every word as Faith delivered her promise to the people federal law was designed to protect. "Baltimore, you've heard promises before," Faith began, her voice carrying across the plaza through federal sound equipment. "Politicians have promised reform, police chiefs have promised accountability, local officials have promised justice." She paused, scanning the faces of people who'd been betrayed too many times to trust easily. "Today, I'm not making a political promise. I'm making a federal commitment. The United States government will maintain oversight of Baltimore Police Department until every resident can walk these streets without fear of police harassment." An elderly man called out from the crowd, "How do we know you won't abandon us like everyone else?" Faith's response was immediate and firm. "Because federal authority means federal accountability. That's not a campaign slogan. That's my oath as a federal officer." She pulled out her federal badge, holding it up for everyone to see. "This badge represents the Constitution of the United States. It means your civil rights are protected by federal law. It means police officers answer to federal authority, not local politics." The crowd's applause was thunderous, but Faith wasn't finished. "Federal oversight isn't temporary relief, it's permanent protection, and I personally guarantee that promise." The healing would take time, but the protection was immediate. 6 months later, Faith stood on the steps of the Baltimore Federal Courthouse as federal prosecutors announced guilty verdicts for all 17 defendants. Wilson had been sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Mayor Anderson received 15 years. The entire corruption network had been dismantled by federal justice. Behind her, the courthouse flew the American flag at full staff, symbolizing justice restored and civil rights protected. "Ladies and gentlemen," Faith addressed the national media gathered for the final press conference, "the Baltimore police corruption case represents more than local law enforcement reform. It represents the federal government's commitment to protecting civil rights wherever they're threatened." She gestured toward the courthouse building, its neoclassical columns representing the permanence of constitutional law. For too long, communities like Baltimore have been told that police accountability is a local issue, that civil rights violations should be handled through local procedures, that federal intervention represents government overreach. Faith's voice grew stronger, carrying the authority of someone who'd faced down corruption and won. Today's convictions prove that civil rights are federal rights, constitutional protections are federal protections, and when local systems fail to protect the vulnerable, federal authority will step in. A reporter called out, "Inspector Brown, what's your message to other communities facing police corruption?" Faith's smile was fierce and determined. "My message is simple. Report it, document it. Federal law enforcement is listening, and federal justice doesn't negotiate with corrupt officials." She paused, letting her final words carry across the country through national television. "Reform isn't a suggestion. It's a federal mandate. Badge comes with accountability. And no one, absolutely no one, is above federal law." The cameras captured her walking up the courthouse steps, federal badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. Justice had been served, federal justice had won, and America was watching.